Welcome to our brief survey of the history of the interpretation of the Tanak, the Old Testament. Our focus in this series of discussions will be primarily on methodology. That is to say, we're not going to emphasize particular interpreters, except to the extent that they made a contribution to the development of the method of Old Testament interpretation. We're also not going to focus primarily on individual books, but rather the techniques, presuppositions, and methodologies that people have employed as they have gone about the task of interpreting the Tanakh. Since we're going to begin this primarily from the perspective of Christian interpretation of the Tanakh, I suppose that it's worth beginning with an observation. That observation is simply this, that we do not really read the Old Testament today in the same way that the New Testament reads the Old Testament. This raises a significant and interesting problem. Namely, is this a problem? Does it matter that we do not interpret the Old Testament today using the same methodologies and techniques that New Testament authors used to interpret the Old Testament? Another way of addressing this question would be to rephrase it. Should this be a problem? Namely, ought it to matter greatly that we do not employ the same method of interpretation today that New Testament authors employed as they went about the task of interpreting the Old Testament? As we walk through the way that we might answer this question by looking at the development of the methodologies of interpretation, we'll find that there are two issues that will come up time and time again in this survey. One issue is the challenge of finding a balance between two different and to a degree conflicting interpretive goals. One interpretive method and the goal associated with it might be to find a way to interpret the text with respect to its historical and literary and contextual environment. I like to call this an exegetical way of reading the text. I use the term exegetical here because it's the kind of technique that is, or kind of concern, that commonly emerges among modern students or exegetes of the Scriptures. The second tendency that is also important for interpreting the Tanakh is the tendency toward a non-historical, non-literary, and non-contextual reading of the biblical message. This, for lack of a better term, I would probably call a devotional approach to reading the text. Devotional in the sense that its primary focus is on what the reader gets out of the text in terms of spiritual benefit. In other words, this first question that's going to come up time and time again in our survey is, how do you read the text in such a way as to preserve a spiritual meaning for the text, while at the same time preserving its historical meaning, recognizing the way it spoke to its own context, and at the same time the way it speaks to us today? So that's the first of the issues we'll encounter time and time again along the way. The second of these issues that we'll encounter many times is, how do we understand the relationship between the Bible as Word of God and Bible as words written on a page by human authors? In other words, what's the relationship between the nature of the text and the authority of the text? Or to put it yet another way, how do we understand the relationship between the Bible as the result of divine inspiration, for those of us who believe that it is the inspired Word of God, and the Bible as the product of a human activity, that is to say, the product of the work of actual human authors. So we might shorten all that down to pose the question, how do you find the Word of God among the human words of the text? So that's a quick look at two issues that will time and time again emerge as we survey the history of the interpretation of the Tanakh.